This week's Bible study is based on Joshua chapter 3, verses 7 to 17, and please read through the passage before you listen to the video. This week we turn to the book of Joshua, which picks up in chapter 1, where we finished last week with the death of Moses. The promise of a land that God reiterated in Deuteronomy chapter 34, verse 4, now begins to come into effect. We assume that the 30-day mourning period for Moses has finished, and straight away it seems that God speaks to Joshua. God emphasises the need to be strong and courageous and to continue to follow the law that had been given through Moses. And the people then have 3 days to get ready to cross over the River Jordan. So that's chapter 1. In chapter 2, the scouts go ahead and see what's there. And we read about their encounter with Rahab, who hides them and protects them because she knows that God is with them, and she's heard about their miraculous crossing of the Red Sea. In gratitude, the scouts promise not to harm her or her family when the whole nation of Israel comes into Jericho. The reading this week, along with last week's reading from Deuteronomy 34, marks the ending of one epic period in Israel's life and the beginning of another. So here we are today on the wilderness side of the Jordan River, waiting to cross over into the land of promise. You may have noticed that it sounds as though we've been here before. There are strong similarities with the story of the crossing of the Red Sea, the story that Rahab has reminded us of in chapter 2. In both of these stories, God works through the divinely chosen leader of the people, and Moses and Joshua both have an important part to play. In both of these stories, the water is miraculously held back until God's people have crossed over and got onto dry land, escaping from danger into the safety of the land where God wants them to be. It's clear that Joshua is called to the same, or at least an equivalent position as Moses. In verse 7, God says, "I will begin to exalt you in the sight of all Israel, so that they may know that I will be with you as I was with Moses." From our human perspective, a change in leadership is often problematic, particularly when the previous leader has been so influential and decisive. It would be no small task to fulfill the role that was left empty by the death of Moses, even with God's approval and blessing. So one of the purposes of this reading is to offer an assurance that Israel will not suffer because of a leadership vacuum. God has commissioned and raised up a new leader. You can compare this with Deuteronomy 31 verse 23, where God commissions Joshua. And the action that follows is designed to signal and endorse this commissioning to the people. In verse 10 then, Joshua tells the people, "By this you shall know that among you is the living God." We get the impression that in the following events, it's not just Joshua's reputation that will be on the line, but God's reputation too. The priests are to walk into the riverbed carrying the Ark of the Covenant, the most sacred object in all Israel, and the thing that represents the actual presence of God with them. We hold our breath, wondering if the water will acknowledge the presence of God, or if we'll be left with a bunch of people with rather wet feet. It's not clear at this point what the 12 representatives of the tribes are to do. They're not allowed to carry the ark, as only the priests could do that. And it doesn't seem that they're going to provide some kind of guard of honour either, as anyone who isn't a priest has to keep well back. In verse 4 of this chapter, we read that nobody else should come within 2,000 miles of within 2,000 cubits, of the ark. 2,000 miles would be a bit far. We don't find out what the role of these 12 representatives is until chapter 4, verse 3. Just to emphasise the magnitude of the miracle that is about to happen, the writer points to the spring floods that are in effect. The harvest referred to in verse 15 is not the autumn harvest at the end of the dry season, but the spring harvest, which happens when the rain first stops. The water would be unusually high, and the geographical location near Jericho is also significant. One commentator wrote, "All the force of the accumulated waters, some of which had begun to course their way down the slopes of Mount Hermon in the far north, now bear down on the mouth of the Jordan and on the path that the tribes are to take. So the writer really wants us to know that the people enter into the promised land through a river in full flood, and not because they simply had to jump over a small trickle. God holds back a huge torrent. It's funny to think of a pile of water, but twice we read about the waters standing in a single heap. In verse 13, Joshua assures the people in advance that the flowing water will be cut off and will stand in a single heap. And then in verse 16, when the crossing actually takes place, we read that the waters rise in a single heap further upstream. In order to protect the people, the priests who were carrying the ark stand in the middle of the riverbed, which is now dry. When the last of the Israelites cross to the other side, the priests follow and step into the promised land, carrying the symbol of the presence of God with them and making sacred the land on which they stand. The goal of 40 years in the wilderness has at last been achieved. God, who called Israel out of Egypt so long ago, has been faithful. God has kept God's promises. We wait to see whether or not the people will keep theirs. If you'd like to reflect on this passage a bit further, there are some questions you might like to consider. So go back to Exodus chapter 14, verses 21 to 31, and read the story of the crossing of the Red Sea. Then reread this passage from Joshua and read it slowly, taking note of any similarities and differences you notice between those two stories. What stands out for you in this passage from Joshua 3? What kind of impression do you get of Joshua, of God, and of the people? Think of a time when you have had to wait for a long time for something to happen. How did you find the waiting time? How did you feel when the event you were expecting finally happened? Think of a time when you've had to face a really difficult task, something that on the surface seems impossible. How did you deal with that? What helped you to achieve it? How do you respond to the idea that God's presence is symbolised in the Ark of the Covenant? Can you think of anything in your life that symbolises the presence of God? This might be a memory or an experience, or it might be an object that holds that same sense for you. How do you think the people felt when they got on the other side of the river? How do you respond when you're facing a new beginning? What thoughts and feelings do you experience? Think about any endings and new beginnings that you are experiencing in your life today. Offer them to God and ask for God's assurance, guidance and blessing as you prepare to step into the unknown.